advocacy and justice, which is today's session. And these are the aims of the session. We're going to focus a little differently here. Rather than just looking at principles, we're going to look at a person's life who really, I think, beautifully illustrates Christian advocacy. And the person we're going to look at is William Wilberforce, who you may have heard of, who played a major role in the abolition of the slave trade in the UK and then later all around the world through his influence. So we're going to look at his story and look at the thinking behind the work he did, to look at what the Bible says about advocacy, and then to recognize and deal with some of the objections to Christian advocacy that are raised. And when we're talking about advocacy, we are talking about Christians speaking out on behalf of others who are being persecuted or oppressed or discriminated against. So we're really talking about the Christian duty to be a voice for the voiceless, to speak on behalf of those who have no voice and those who are being marginalized in our society. And the focus here in this talk is on slavery, but you could apply this to any issue of human rights, whether it's human trafficking or embryo research or abortion or euthanasia or the needs of those who are suffering from addictions or the elderly who are suffering from dementia, or cancer sufferers, anybody that we meet who doesn't have a voice that we could be in a position to speak for on behalf of Christ and how we can influence the world. So what I'm going to say is pretty much all based on this little booklet I did on the life of William Wilberforce. The main benefit of this is that it's quite brief. There are much, much longer and much more scholarly and comprehensive works on the life of William Wilberforce. And I do hope that this short talk inspires you to look at them and to learn more about them. But you'll find on the ICMDA website that this is available, not just in English, but it's been translated into French and Russian as well. You may have seen the film Amazing Grace, which is inspired by the life of William Wilberforce, and it is reasonably historically accurate. It's not entirely accurate, but it's a good introduction. The one thing that Amazing Grace doesn't tell you so much is about the thinking behind his Christian faith, but it's a very dramatic illustration of his story. And the title, of course, is based on the most famous hymn in the English language, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, which was written by John Newton, a close friend of Wilberforce's, who was a pastor in the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain, and who originally before that was a slave trader. And when he was converted, and eventually it took him a while, but he turned after his conversion against slavery and became part of the group of people who were working for the abolition of slavery. So Amazing Grace was his song. Now, William Wilberforce, you can see the dates he lived there. He was born in 1759 and he died in 1833. And if you know your history well, you'd know that this was an incredibly turbulent period in Europe. It was the age of discovery, when particularly English and French explorers were going all around the world and discovering other parts of the world, leading on to colonialism. It was, of course, the time of American independence in the 1770s, when the American Constitution was written. It was also the time of the French Revolution in the late 1780s and 90s. So it was a time when national borders were being removed. It was the time of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. So this was the period that he'd lived through. And William Wilberforce was married. He had 6 children. He loved playing with his children. And he said that his children were the saving grace in his life, because of all the difficulty that he went through in working against great opposition to fight against slavery, the fact that he could come home at night and enjoy his kids and play with them. And I think it's a great challenge to us that being involved in Christian work should not lead us to disregard the needs of our families, but actually our families are something that God gives us as part of his grace. He was a bright young man. He went to Cambridge University in 1776. He was only 17 years at that time. He was already very well educated. And he studied at St. John's College, and there he met a number of other people who worked with him. So the picture on the left here is Wilberforce as a young boy. And then on the right here, at the time when he was going into Parliament in the early part of the or the late part of the 18th century. And during this time, there were amazing things happening in Britain. The 1700s was the time of the evangelical revival under Wesley and Whitefield, who were astonishing preachers, and many, many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people were converted as they preached throughout the period from the 1730s all the way through to the late 1700s. And it was also the time of the Great Awakening in the United States, led by people like Jonathan Edwards, when there was a massive revival and turning to Christ. And these men crossed the Atlantic Ocean several times on ships. They all knew each other. They prayed for each other. They worked together. So it was quite an extraordinary time to be alive. And this evangelical revival led on in the early 1800s to two things. One of them was extraordinary social reform. And we're going to learn a bit about that, starting with slavery. But also it led to the modern missionary movement, because it was in the 1790s, 1792, that George Carey left Britain to go to India. And the modern missionary movement is seen as starting with Carey. He did an astonishing job out there, and many, many others were inspired by his example and following him. So that was the time Wilberforce lived. In England, we had the third of 6 King Georges were on the throne. We know him as Mad King George. Some people think he had porphyria because he had evidence of mental illness. And we talk about King George as the king who lost the colonies, because the revolution started or happened in America at that time. So he lost America. And then places like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada were all being discovered and colonized. It was the time of the French Revolution, as I've mentioned, but also the time of the Enlightenment, the rise of a movement rejecting biblical revelation and based around human reason, and particularly expressing itself in the French Revolution. So this is the time in which he lived. And like all people, he was influenced by those times, and he was influenced by people he met. We believe, we know that he met Whitefield and Wesley, for example, and was influenced by their preaching. But he had another number of other influences as well. William Pitt was the Prime Minister at the beginning of the 19th century of England, and was a Christian believer and a very close friend of Wilberforce's. And also with him, William Grenville, who later became Prime Minister and was a cabinet minister in Parliament in the early 1800s. And there was a time when these three Williams, William Wilberforce, Pitt, and Grenville, all met together at a home in London and had a conversation under an apple tree, where they decided that William Wilberforce would be the one to lead the effort against the slave trade, and that the other two would support him from their positions of power in the English government. So they were close friends. Isaac Milner was a fellow student at Cambridge University, and he asked William Wilberforce to go over the English Channel into France on a trip to the French Riviera. And it was during that journey that Isaac Milner suggested that they both read a book by Philip Doddridge, who was a famous preacher at the time. Now, at this time, William Wilberforce was not a Christian. He was, in many ways, a very ungodly man who was involved with drink and other forms of immorality, and also foul language and so on. He said he was a really godless man, but he was converted during this trip by reading this book with Isaac Milner, and he came back a changed man. And at this time, he had already, with William Pitt, gone into Parliament, and they were just in their early 20s at this time, just very young men. And then he committed himself to the cause of slavery around that time. John Newton, I mentioned already. I'll come back to him. And then Charles Clarkson was another student at the same university in Cambridge who did a lot of the research work behind the action against the slave trade. Here are some pictures. So top left, this is George Whitefield, who they say could preach to 20,000 people at a time, preached in the UK, across the Atlantic several times, preached at the very spot where Biden is now being sworn into place as the next president of the US. And they say he could stand on Capitol Hill and people could hear him a mile away. He had such a powerful voice. Of course, what he said was very powerful as well. Many people converted under Whitefield's preaching. And then John Wesley, who was also a very famous preacher in the evangelical revival, and he said to Whitefield, so he said to Wilberforce, unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? And so John Wesley encouraged him in his fight against slavery. Up in the top right here, we have John Newton. As you can see, the old African blasphemer who was a former slave ship captain and author of the hymn Amazing Grace. And he knew Wilberforce as a boy. And actually Wilberforce, after he became a Christian, thought that he should leave Parliament because it was not a place for a Christian to be. And it was John Newton who encouraged him to remain in politics for the good of the nation. And it's an important thing that he did that, because history would have been very different otherwise. And John Newton recognized the importance of his work. This down the bottom is William Pitt, who became the Prime Minister at the age of 24, incredibly young, and supported Wilberforce in all his efforts to do it. And the picture in the middle, this is Mad King George the King, who I mentioned earlier. This is what Parliament looked like at the time. This is a drawing of Wilberforce speaking in Parliament, and he faced incredible opposition at the beginning of his work. Now, we know a lot about him because he left behind a lot of books as well as the things that are written about him. And one of the best books to read is called A Practical View of Christianity, if you can get that in the English language. And in that we learn about his two great objects. And when he became a Christian, he felt that God was calling him to do two things. Firstly, to suppress the slave trade, which was to make the slave trade illegal and to make slavery ultimately illegal. And then the second object he had was the reformation of morals. So he wanted to do far more to the heart of the nation. And this is Wilberforce's essential philosophy. And if you get a chance to listen to John Piper on Wilberforce, he explains this in much more detail than we have time to do today. But essentially, Wilberforce believed that there were what he called peculiar doctrines, peculiar teaching. And what he meant by that was the basics of the Christian gospel. So the existence of God as creator and sustainer of the universe, Christ as the Son of God dying on a cross and rising from the dead, justification by faith, the ascension and return of Christ, the authority of Scripture. These were the basic foundations on which William Wilberforce's life was built, a personal faith in the Trinitarian God. And he believed that once a person grasped and understood and believed those teachings, then it led to a change in the person's heart, what he called true affections. So he said that the heart would be moved and there would be a deep desire to live for God and to speak for him. And that would result, that change of heart would result in moral transformation. So once you believe these teachings, once your heart has changed, then your whole life will change and you'll begin to behave in a very different way, and you'll be gradually transformed into the likeness of Christ and become more godly in the way you live. And then the final step, he believed, is that when Christian men and women got into positions of influence within society, whether it was the universities or the institutions like medicine or in Parliament itself, that as they lived out their Christian lives faithfully, that would lead to political reformation and changes in the laws and the whole direction of society, the direction it would take. And so that was how William Wilberforce saw it, that the Christian faith worked out through individuals in society would be salt and light in society and lead to genuine change and changes in laws. That's what motivated him. So this was his view on the gospel and social justice. He saw speaking and being a voice for the voiceless was just part of his normal Christian witness. He had a strong evangelical faith, and he was involved, as I said, in things other than slavery. So there was a group called the Clapham Sect, and they were named like this because these were a group of parliamentarians and businessmen and professionals who lived in the area of Clapham Common in the centre of London, just south of the River Thames. All of them lived around this common or this park, and they attended the same church together, Holy Trinity, Clapham. And they used to meet together in each other's houses and pray about the reformation of society. And people in the Clapham sect went on to reform British society on the basis of their Christian convictions. Wilberforce was also involved in the Sunday school movement. He gave a lot of money to establishing it, and he was involved in the formation of the Church Mission Society, which sent missionaries around the world. So it wasn't just advocacy or social justice he was concerned with, but with evangelism, discipleship, and transforming society in lots of different ways. If you go to St. John's College today, you will see this statue of Wilberforce, and these are the time scales, the time that he lived. But he entered Parliament in about 1790, and then he brought his first bill shortly afterwards. They say he spoke for about 4 hours in Parliament trying to abolish slavery, and his bill was defeated by an overwhelming majority. But he did not give up. He continued with speech after speech, bill after bill, until eventually, 17 years later, in 1807, he brought a bill which was voted through by a huge majority to abolish the slave trade. So that made trading of slaves illegal in Britain. And but it didn't make slavery illegal. It made the selling of slaves illegal. Now that made a huge difference, and it meant that the British government was then committed to stopping the slave trade wherever it happened in the world. And it was in 1833, just a couple of months before he died, that, and he was sick in bed, so he heard the news of this, that slavery itself was made illegal, and it was then illegal to keep slaves. Now, if you look at the year there, 1833, it wasn't until 1865, almost more than 30 years later, that slavery was made illegal in the United States under Abraham Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. So Britain was very early on, and that was almost entirely because of Wilberforce and the friends that he worked with. So just a reminder again, his two aims, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of morals or manners, which the work he did through the Clapham sect, everything from stopping child labour to eventually securing rights for women, the vote for women, providing care for the poor, looking after orphans and so on. All of this work grew out of the social justice work that William Wilberforce did throughout the whole of the 19th century. And in Britain, we owe so many of our laws to the changes that these men and women worked through. I say women, there were women involved in this group, certainly later in the century as well. We could spend a lot of time talking about them, but these are two of the women who supported him. And we read in the New Testament about the powerful and rich women who traveled around with Jesus and his disciples and who funded the work that he was doing. And these women were very similar. So Hannah More, you see her in 1789 here, she was one of Wilberforce's closest friends and allies, and in support of both of his great objects. And she helped to fund his work and was a great writer and speaker in her own right. Madame de Stael, another one who was greatly taken with Wilberforce. So there we have it. Lots of early efforts leading to the Slave Trade Act, which abolished the trading in slavery, and then the Abolition of Slavery Act, which stopped slavery altogether. Some more pictures of Wilberforce. This was now, how did Wilberforce work? Well, through a variety of different means. He had people working with him, and one of the people who worked very closely with him was this man, William Cowper, who died in 1800, so quite early on. And he's regarded as the greatest poet of the evangelical revival and one of the greatest poets of the 18th century in Britain. He wrote Christian hymns, he wrote many poems, and he wrote poems about slavery. The Negro's Lament was one of the poems that he wrote. And he was also a very close friend of John Newton. And William Cowper suffered from severe depression, and there were no drug treatments at that time. But Newton used to walk with him and encourage him and help him to develop his creative genius in being a writer and a poet. They didn't have photography, they didn't have videos. So how were they to get the stories out and tell what was happening with slavery? Well, it was often in creative art and line drawing. So this is an example of a ship carrying slaves with all the slaves stored below deck and the terrible conditions in which they had to live. So people would draw pictures of these and make them into pamphlets and circulate them. Here's another one, the legal drowning of 132 Africans who were thrown overboard from one of the slave ships across the Atlantic. And so when people drew these pictures, they told the stories using them. And that was what began to convince the British public that slavery was wrong. This is, they call this the image that stopped 1,000 ships, Josiah Wedgwood's anti-slavery cameo. And this was put on brooches, hat pins, cufflinks, watch fobs, and so on. So bracelets. And you can see the words here, am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a man and a brother? And here's an African man in chains as a slave. And so it was helping to convince British people of the humanity that these were people just like them, who were their brothers, who were being treated like this. So what does the Bible say about advocacy? Well, we see all the way through Scripture, there are people, particularly in the Old Testament, who were influential within government and in positions of authority as social reformers and statesmen. So Joseph is a good example in Egypt, helping to stop the effects of the famine, storing up food, saving people in that way. Nehemiah was a cabinet minister, if you like, for the king of Persia. Esther and Mordecai, of course, worked together in Persia. in great positions of authority, Esther to save the Jews from discrimination and death. And then, of course, Daniel and his friends in the book of Daniel. We've looked at the life of Daniel already in the way that they were influential. So they served in Babylon and were in the world, very much involved in it, but not part of it, not influenced by its morals. And we see the pattern here is that these people did not withdraw into their holy huddles or into their escapist ghettos or into their Christian, or at least their believers groups, and separate themselves off from society. They got very much engaged. And as Jeremiah called the disciples, seek the good, or call the Jews in Babylon, seek the good of the city to which I've called you, because in its welfare you will find your welfare. So there's a very strong trend through in the Jewish people being an influence in pagan societies, societies that were quite hostile to their faith. Now, what are the biblical principles here? Well, let's look at some of them. First of all, the sovereignty of God, that God is absolutely king and sovereign and in control over everything that happens in the world, whether it is biological processes or physical processes or personal processes or political processes. And so Daniel tells us that the Most High God is sovereign over all of the nations of the earth and gives them to anyone he chooses. So it's God who raises up kings and governments and presidents, and he brings them down. He brought down Hillary Clinton and raised up Donald Trump. He brought down Donald Trump and raised up Joe Biden. It's God who is sovereign over these processes. And Christians are called, on the one hand, to be good citizens, obeying the laws of their country and playing a positive part in it, but also to exercise freedom of conscience, so that when we're forced to do things which we know are wrong, we resist that. So we're to be good citizens, but recognize that we serve God, not men. And all the way through the Old Testament, particularly in the prophetic literature, we read about this wonderful God of justice. And I put some of the scriptures there that will be familiar to you, about being a voice to the voiceless, about righteousness rolling down like a river, about pursuing justice and mercy. And then there's Jesus' Nazareth Manifesto, where he talks about the good news to the poor and the release of suffering, or release of the captives, and the healing of the sick. But also, do you remember, proclaiming the acceptable year of the Lord, the importance of justice, and the importance for Christians to count the cost in order that they can speak for those with no voice. So there's some of the biblical principles. And then just in closing, I wanted to go very quickly through some of the arguments that people bring to try and argue that Christians should not be involved in advocacy and should not be involved in public policy. So let's just consider those briefly, and then we'll have a time of discussion. So some people will argue that justice is the role of government, but we would say no, justice is the responsibility of every individual, and that in democratic societies, it's we who elect government. So we are responsible for the people we choose and the policies they make. Some will say the church's real work is evangelism, but I'd suggest the church's real work is disciples. It's making disciples who will obey God and honor him in every area of their lives. That's what the Great Commission was all about. And as Wilberforce tells us, when people's lives are transformed, they will be salt and light, and they'll bring about change through advocacy as well. Some people say Christians shouldn't get involved in politics. Well, it's God who raises up kings and presidents and brings them down. So God's very much involved. So why shouldn't we be? And of course, as we've seen, there are many people in the Old Testament times and throughout Christian history who have got involved in politics and in shaping the direction of a society. Some people say we live in a pluralist society and people aren't Christians, but again, we're called to be salt and light, even if we are a small minority. Some people say laws will not change people's hearts, and that's true, but laws do restrain the heartless from acting unjustly. People say you can't legislate morality, and that is true, but the law is a very powerful educator of public opinion, and when laws are eroded and protections are removed, then whole societies can change. Some people say we should be doing social service, not social justice. In other words, it's fine to feed the hungry and heal the sick, visit those in prison, look after widows and orphans and so on. That's all social service. But we shouldn't be doing social justice in terms of being a voice for the voiceless. But a lot of the evil in our societies is institutional evil transcribed in laws. And I'd argue that we should be doing both social service and social justice. Some people say we'll just antagonize people, or we should just be commending the gospel and not winding people up by trying to change the laws. But of course, Jesus said that whatever we do, we're faithful to him, then we will be persecuted. So we shouldn't be upset by the fact that people oppose what we're doing. We should think about our responsibilities. We don't have a right to impose our morality. Some people say, well, I'd say, no, we have a responsibility to do what we can to ensure that the laws in our country protect those people who are vulnerable and weak from exploitation and abuse, whatever they are, whether they're the victims of human trafficking or elderly people with dementia or babies in the womb. We shouldn't restrict people's freedoms, some people say, but of course every law restricts freedoms and every law stops some people doing what they desperately want to do. And we recognize that in a democratic society, we have to live with a balance of freedom and restriction, and that the laws are there to protect innocent and vulnerable people. And we recognize that there are limits to freedom. That's why we have laws, and that's why we have the rule of law. Others will say we should be known what we're for, not for what we're against. In other words, we should always be arguing very positively for good things, not against bad things. Well, I think we should be doing both. And we see that Jesus did both. And we look at the commands in Scripture. Some of them tell us what to do, and others tell us what not to do. We need to be against bad things as well as for good things. And so this raises the question, what are the equivalents of the slave trade today? And that's a question which we all need to ask. We look back on the 19th century, we're amazed that people supported slavery, but most of society, including the church, did, sadly, at that time. And they had to have their eyes opened up. And of course, justice issues are different in every culture and in every time and in every country. So we need to be asking God, who are the voiceless today? And how can we speak for them, be advocates for them as doctors and dentists and people of influence? The importance of prayer, the importance of a biblical balance. It's not just evangelism, it's not just social justice, it's not just social action, it's all of these things together are part of discipleship. And it's so important that we carry the cross. In other words, that we're prepared to suffer for the sake of those that we're seeking to protect and speak for, knowing that there will be opposition, but that we walk in the footsteps of one who carried the cross and who said things that people didn't like in the course of his work, but who was prepared to suffer on our behalf.